Welcome to Redefine the Circle, a podcast where we discuss all things pitching. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. In this podcast, we're going to highlight topics that focus on how to maximize your pitchers now. We're going to discuss some of the trends that we've seen at S2 Breakthrough and talk about how we use data to create systems and training approaches that are specific to each pitcher. It's so important for us to continue to share this information and facilitate discussion within the pitching community so we can keep evolving as coaches and ultimately grow pitching into something it's never been before. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for joining the quest to redefine the circle. Hi everyone, welcome to Redefine the Circle. Today we are kicking off a brand new series, so 5 episodes all on a related concept. And throughout this series, I am going to be joined by none other than our own Dr. Laura McDonald, our Director of Athlete Health and Performance. Laura, welcome to Redefine the Circle.
I am thrilled.
Have you ever been on this podcast before?
Not. This is my first time.
Wow. Okay. Well, Laura and I work very closely together all day, every day. This is the first time she's joining us here on the podcast, so this is exciting. The topic of this series, usually when we are thinking about what is a great Redefine the Circle topic, what are the types of things we're seeing on a regular basis, the things we're feeling really passionate about in the moment, it's sort of a no-brainer. This time of year, we are in the middle of summer after here in Illinois, a long high school season. We are nearing the end of the summer season and dealing with athletes and pitcher, more specifically, obviously, pain is on the front of our brains and on the top of our desks every single day. So
something daily.
Yeah. So we really want to dive into this topic of like, what is going on with this culture? What have we seen? What are the types of things that we're doing in order to navigate it? And it's a big deal. It's a big deal as far as the many layers that are contributing to a culture of pain for our pitchers. And so this is why we thought it deserved an entire series.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's dive in. First and foremost, I think the first place to start is to understand that we know that we have had this really bad reputation in pitching. Not we, meaning the motion has gotten this really bad reputation of being natural. And of like, you can throw as much as you want.
Just hearing the more natural motion triggers me. Just hearing that triggers me.
Totally. Okay, so we want to break this down. We did do an entire presentation webinar on this through the Alliance, actually. And so we're just kind of like sum it up in, 3 to 5 quick minutes, okay? Okay, so essentially the history behind us, the motion getting that sort of like label or getting categorized that way is really behind this concept of what we know happens in baseball is with the overhand motion. There's a lot of joint force at the elbow, right? Because of the position of the arm at layback and then how much stress there is. Because we don't have that, because our layback position is different, obviously where the elbow position is in relation to the body during deceleration, we have less joint force at the elbow.
Yes. I think the other kind of key piece is, baseball pitching, we get up here in this 90-90 position. It's really, really delicate for the shoulder. And so I think there's been an assumption that because we're not up here, that somehow down here is safer. And
sure.
I think that there's just different nuances to some of those forces. But the elbow conversation has obviously in the face of Tommy John in baseball has driven a lot of that conversation.
Sure. Okay. So now they're like, well, it's not the same for you with the elbows. You guys, this is natural. The windmill is natural. You can do it as much as you want. And in reality, what we have now seen as we've collected so much information and data on the other movements in the game, that the physical nature of softball pitching is arguably the most complicated movement in the game. It is a ton of stress on the body. It is a ton of demand on a variety of parts of the body, on forearm, on back, on hip, just across the board. It is not natural. It's actually a ton of demand on the body as a whole.
I think we misunderstood it for so long. I think really getting to the root of understanding it has helped us to see its complexity. And I think that's why we've reached this point of we've got to talk about how complex it is and then what the after effects are, especially when it happens so early, so young, and so often.
For sure. So I'm going to actually jump over to my screen here and just walk through an athlete going through a motion and just talk about Well, what do you mean it's the most complex movement in the game? Like, overhand throwing and hitting, like why are those, would you put those in a category underneath of pitching? So switching gears, let's take a look at this computer. Okay, so here we have a pitcher. I'm gonna let her motion kind of play out. I might scroll it to speed it up a little bit. What we know essentially is that what is different about the underhand motion is that it is an airborne motion, an open chain. What this means is that even though we have it in the rules that we have to drag our toe, essentially, we have to drag this toe, we don't actively get to use the ground. That alone makes it a really complicated movement. But in addition to that, this is a high-speed video, so obviously this is going to take quite a bit of time as it's scrolling through. I might be able to speed it up. Here we go. What happens is that we push off from the ground as pitchers, and we have to start unraveling rotation basically by the time we get to this point. We know that there's sort of like an ideal of how much rotation you're able to achieve, because what happens is from this point to the top of the arm circle is that this athlete has fully accomplished this like initial turn. She's like facing her dominant side. This is now what is setting up what is the most important part of the motion. So our goal is to establish a lot of stretch from the body through the arm in order then to unravel a lot of energy. So what's going to happen now at this point is she's going to start rotating back to her target. Our goal at this point is to feel as if, one, this athlete is able to hold good enough posture between trunk and pelvis to be able to sustain rotation. And two, that she's able to do it on time so that her arm is above the layback position. Because by the time now her trunk decelerates or rotates toward the target, now all that stretch is coming through the layback. And now that all of that stretch, she can then internally rotate through the shoulder. She can pronate through the forearm, and this is how energy is transferred. So essentially, the reason why I am saying it is arguably, I would say not arguably, but the most difficult, the most complicated movement in the game is because of this concept of being able to create two turns while in an airborne phase. It is incredibly complicated, so complicated that we now, after collecting hundreds and hundreds of biomechanics assessments on athletes of all ages across the country, we realize there's this idea of what's optimal, but here at S2, what we are not doing is like chasing optimal. It is such a complicated movement that what we want to know is that what is someone's baseline level of their patterns, their level of efficiency. What is that allowing them to do on the ball? Do we need to attack that in order to gain more on the ball? Is there pain going on that we need to go through? But it's such a complicated movement that very rarely are we looking at athletes where we're saying like, your patterns look great. It's just too much to manage, essentially.
For sure.
So coming back to this, what I'd like to show now are some of the really common things. These are not the only categories of things that we see, but these are some of the common types of patterns that we see that lead to things like pain. So here we are with this concept of when posture breaks, a variety of reasons why this happens. But when posture breaks and athletes are not able to keep neutral posture, what we see is essentially examples of things like this. This is where we might experience pain like in the low back. We're seeing things like athletes having stress fractures in the lumbar region here, this low back area, because they're trying to rotate from a really compromised posture, essentially. The next one here is what I want to talk about is when athletes sort of like directionally don't allow themselves, they don't load in an appropriate way. And so then when they launch, they land in a direction that really is off target. So these are right-handed pitchers in this example. So they're landing like more toward the left. So what happens is that they're forced to decelerate with like a lot of frontal plane, like hiking, which is a ton of stress in this sort of like, I say SI joint, this low back region here, hip, decel here, because essentially they're really landing. Their lower half is in a direction off to the non-dominant side. Their upper body is really tilting to stay on track with the target. And this is where athletes have a lot of pain in this region right here. The next one I want to show is two things. It's really when the arm is taking on way too much. So in this example over here to the left, we're seeing an athlete whose posture broke so much so that she wasn't really able to rotate back well. So essentially her body really gets left behind. And the reason this would be better as a video actually, but essentially her body is really not coming along with her in order to help decelerate her energy. So her arm is going to have to put on all of the brakes. This is where we're seeing a lot of what might start as like posterior shoulder issues, and then eventually it starts to look more like anterior shoulder. The athlete over here is an example of someone who typically is not very stable. And so because of that, maybe it might even just not be stability. It could be that the arm wraps around the head, variety of things where at deceleration, this final phase of the motion, there's really this disconnect. The arm is not connected to the body or the trunk. And so then because of that, all of the brakes are being put on the arm. And so again, sometimes it might start as posterior or back of the shoulder pain, but then it navigates or gravitates, I should say, toward the anterior, the front side of the shoulder. Okay, lastly, this is interesting because at first look, there's really nothing like pattern-wise you would see about these pictures, maybe this one to the top, but generally, when we are looking at pictures that do a really great job of segmenting their arms, so typically the patterns that we looked at in the past don't really allow the arm to get in a good segmented position. When we do have athletes who can get into that segmented position, what happens is that there's already a lot of stress on the forearm muscles here, essentially, okay? And so yes, it yields usually pretty good ball flight data, things that are really interesting about them. It might be a lot of horizontal movement, a lot of backspin or upspin. So it's good ball flight. But what we know about these athletes is if the trunk does not stay stable, so you can even see a difference between these two pictures. When there's not a lot of trunk stability, then what happens is this is already a pretty tough position to be able to hold, although it's a very positive position. And so when the trunk is not doing its job, it's just asking too much of that elbow / forearm, right? We see this show up as things like wrist pain, forearm pain, even elbow pain, right?
I think some of what's interesting about a lot of these patterns too is that, the Tommy John conversation in baseball and the elbow, it's so acute. Right? And so it gets a lot of attention. It's like ACL tears in soccer players. It gets a lot of attention. It's expensive to treat. It requires surgery, typically long rehabilitations. And so, when that happens to an athlete, it tends to get a lot of, media attention, right? It's a pretty devastating injury. And I think what, the pattern we're really seeing here is that a lot of these pain issues are really insidious. They're very much over time. They don't just pop up one day. They've been built and built and built over, trunk control issues and workload, mismanagement. And I think that sometimes that leads to a less urgent conversation because they're not these acute injuries. I think, where we do see some of that acuteness is, ACL tears in pitchers, right, on that landing leg. But these low back issues, these forearm issues, it seems to be part and parcel with just being a pitcher. And I think that that's a part of the culture we have to really dive into and talk about is a lot of these things are building over time.
Absolutely. And I would argue this is the culture that we're addressing right now. This concept of that, all of these red flags, all of these signs are out there, not only in an athlete reporting their pain, which is an important piece, which we'll talk about, but there are patterns that are indicators that they're more likely, the way we measure biomechanics is levels of efficiency. When we have low efficiency patterns, those athletes are more likely to experience pain if their workload is not managed appropriately. So part of it may be that obviously we're trying to train them to have more efficient patterns. But at the college level, oftentimes we're seeing athletes at the end of their careers. Sometimes we're even linking inefficient patterns to really good ball flight because of the compensations they make. We are not trying to attack their patterns. We're simply trying to say, but you do have to understand that those patterns are putting them at increased risk of pain. And therefore, we have to manage workload a little bit differently. If not in games, certainly in training in between games, right? So you're right. This is what we're seeing, this building. Basically, the motion is so difficult that the body is in compromised positions. And we have said, well, it's natural and there's no such thing as doing it too much. And so now we're overthrowing, throwing in positions that the body is really not meant to take that much force in those particular areas.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's just sort of a nuts and bolts of the complexity of the motion, the types of things that we're seeing and why here at S2. The next thing that I think we want to talk about is that something that we obviously really target and do what I think a really great job of. And we have the luxury of this because the strength floor is right next to where we pitch. But to us, human movement is human movement, right? So the way in which we're attacking efficiency in the way that pitchers are moving, we want to make sure that we're helping in training to give them better movement quality, which sits at strength and conditioning, right? Traditionally, the way we've done things in strength and conditioning and pitching, and I would argue that, like, I think the strength and conditioning world is also archaic. This is probably unpopular opinion.
Controversial.
Yes, and unpopular opinion that pitching is archaic. In softball, we know this. This is why we were like I thought, I'm archaic. I have to get in there and figure out how to progress this, right? And so this is really how S2 was like launched. But the culture of pitching really sits in these like archaic notions. And I, again, would probably argue that a lot of strength and conditioning is as well. Now, coaches are pushing, people are trying to get more educated. But the way that it's really been laid out is the goal of strength and conditioning is to make athletes stronger and more powerful. And what we're seeing is that when they sit in those silos and strength and conditioning doesn't actually understand what movement quality pitchers need to have for good, efficient motions, all they're doing is pouring fuel on a fire. So a really inefficient pitcher who has poor patterns, now we're making her stronger and more powerful through them. And so when we're seeing power numbers go up, but movement quality is not going up, this is like the
warning bells.
Yeah, this is the recipe for pain. 100%. So like getting these two concepts to really integrate and understand, like we're not just chasing power. It's not like I'm the strength coach and I'm going to be like, yeah, look at these power numbers. If over here we know this is a really low efficiency, she has really low efficiency movement. And even as we'll show in a second, what it looks like for her not to have like fundamental movement capacity. Anyway, can you chime in? I am going to show what this even means, like how we score this in our assessment, what movement quality even looks like. But is there anything that you want to chime in on regarding this like siloed approach to strength and power versus like, well, that's the pitching side. I'm the strength coach.
Yeah, I think where we see this probably most extreme is at the college level, to be honest. I mean, when there is this disconnect of, I'm the strength coach, I sit over here, I don't tell you how to do your job, right? That's a very common statement that gets made sometimes. In and having conversations with college coaches, they get frustrated. They're saying, I need this change in my pitchers. I need my pitchers to be able to move this way or do these particular things, and they don't have anything to hold the strength coach accountable to other than the metrics that the strength coach says are important. And so I think it's really critical. I always say this to our college coaches or pitching coaches is you're the director of performance for your pitchers, right? What is it that you need to bring to that strength coach to hold them accountable? And I think movement quality is a big one. If the strength program is not developing movement quality underneath the pitching that it needs to, I think that's a real conversation of we're just chasing two separate goals here, and they're not talking to each other. And so, as you said, power, fuel to the fire. I mean, I can think of, 20 examples of kids we've had in our facility where they've had huge growth spurts and, they've just gone through maturation and puberty's done a lot for them. And then, they start to add that fuel to the fire, and it gets tricky when they're not navigating that through good stability.
Right.
And so, heaven forbid, we're even talking about the high school level with, whether or not there is a strength coach present, whether or not those ratios are good. There's a lot of gaps to fall through.
For sure.
And I think that's really tricky.
So I'm going to switch gears back to the computer here. And what I want to pull up is just a couple kind of like examples of how we are measuring from an assessment standpoint. Our goal is for this to look and speak pitching, essentially. So when we're looking at this, we have just baseline levels of stability that athletes need to be able to have. Pelvic stability. Can they hinge? Can they tilt the pelvis? Can they really start to really navigate their trunk? Can they stabilize their trunk as they're going from two legs to one leg in this reverse lunge? Do they have good, strong anterior core to be able to put on brakes? Do they have rotational capacity? These are mobility concepts. And then can they absorb force on a single leg, and particularly coming out of rotation, which is being asked in pitching? Over here, we have things of like, what strategies do they use for rotation potentially? And then is the lat in good shape to be able to essentially from that layback position actually transfer that energy? The reason why I show this is not just to bring up the categories that we use here and the ways in which we use movement quality to really gauge whether or not an athlete has what it takes to have good efficient patterns. But here's an example of a pitcher whose power numbers we'd say were like pretty decent. They were really pushing an above average in the ways. This is a broad jump, not labeled in this one, but a broad jump and a med ball throw. So ability to produce power from the ground, ability to produce power from the front side of the body were pretty good. She had good velo. But then we go ahead and look at what's going on here regarding her movement quality, this is 100% a red flag for us at S2, because we know, okay, if this athlete had low power and threw maybe like 54, 55, you know, we're expecting to essentially see like she's probably not going to have pain because it's just not enough fuel in the fire. But if the strength coach is over here like, yeah, look how powerful she is, she can lift this, she can do this, but none of this is coming along with her, then what's happening is, even if velocity starts to go up, what we typically see is that it doesn't,
Right.
because it can't, you're not able to essentially like get into the right stretch tension. So it usually doesn't, but if it does, it is at the cost of like, oh, we really have these. Those are when we put like a big, like high alert. We have a kid throwing mid to upper 60s, and she has movement quality like this, like from a stability and rotational capacity standpoint. This is like, we get a little like scared for her, and we try to, without saying like you're going to get hurt because that's not appropriate, we make it very clear that like you are in our like high alert category where we really have to watch. And you have to go back, if you are doing outside strength and conditioning through high school, whatever that looks like, and talk to them about like the goal is not strength and power. We are, as Carly uses this analogy, like basically like it's too much horsepower in an engine that can't handle it.
It's all gas and no brakes.
Yes. Absolutely. So I thought this was a good example, just showing like how we are kind of gauging. Maybe an athlete has really pretty good, stable patterns. Those are the athletes then that we're likely expecting to see better movement quality underneath of her. And now obviously strength and power are important, but it's making sure that we are not like skipping steps and just going for things that like, well, of course we made to make you more powerful. We're not talking about like a sagittal plane dominant move. If velocity, if energy is going to be transferred efficiently to preserve her health and wellness in the quest of chasing performance, then movement quality has got to be at the center of what we know our athletes can do well.
I think this is a, point of clarification for our strength and conditioning systems. It's not that we never chase power in those systems. It's not that is never a point of improvement for our athletes, but the reality is the power that they have to output in the pitching motion at the volume at which they do it, at the intensity at which they do it, far outpaces essentially that expression of power on that poor movement quality. So we want them to be safe, we want them to be healthy, we want them to have longevity, and I use the phrase not a glass cannon, they can only throw one inning without pain. Then they've got to bring up their movement quality underneath of that. Then we need to start tackling the power concept and watching how it translates into pitching.
Okay, so we've got two layers so far.
Lots of layers.
We've got that the motion is so complicated, we're not even really judging the motion off of level of efficiency. And then we oftentimes have strength and conditioning siloed. Maybe pitchers aren't even doing strength and conditioning, and then that is like a real disaster essentially, right? I shouldn't say disaster, but it is from a movement quality standpoint. Right. Or if they are, the strength coach is like, we want velocity, go for power, go for power. And so then we have this like real disconnect. These are the layers that we're starting to see of what's happening. So if a pitcher's throwing 65, we're like, that pitcher's amazing. But no one is talking about, yeah, but we're not looking at all the layers underneath. We're not looking at the foundation that is shaking beyond belief for this
How
kid.
long can she sustain that?
100%.
Right.
This is where we're ignoring what's going on underneath. Okay, so the third piece then is workload. And this goes all the way back to where we started, which was like, it's a natural motion. There are no such thing as pitch counts. You can throw it all day, all night. And we just simply know like it's just not true. So here's the third piece where workload is out of control. Okay, so we put pain, health and wellness. We put health and wellness at the center of everything we do here. We would never chase performance, and we chase performance. That's our goal here, but we never chase it while ignoring athlete health and wellness, right? It's always at the center of everything we do. So we get through our off season, again, in Illinois for our local athletes, different athletes have different high school seasons, but for the most part, the majority of the country sits like a spring high school season. This is the high school level, and then goes into their summer season, right? So we get through the off season. We feel like, all right, pitchers, we have daily health questionnaires, health and wellness questionnaires. We know our pitchers are feeling good. We've pushed their volume. We are obviously aware of things like how much they're going to be throwing. We feel like we're arming them to the max while also trying to attack performance, right? Okay, so after that, we still ask our pitchers to report pain, to report how they're doing throughout their actual seasons. And this is where it starts to get alarming for us. It's like there is no such thing, basically, for pitchers as chasing performance and developing throughout this time of year. It feels as if, it's not the case, not the majority, but it feels as if every day it's just my arm is hurting, I'm starting to have back pain. We're just navigating all from like March through August, essentially, pain management. So I asked you to go back and really pull the data of our pitchers who were healthy going into their spring seasons to kick off the high school into summer, the high school level, of course. How many of them have experienced pain during their season so far?
Before I even reveal the number, which I think we both found alarming when we first talked about this, I think the conversation of that we even ask this question in the first place is really important, that we even put this at the forefront of their minds, that it should be something that you do talk about, that pain is something that you say, this isn't normal for my body, this is not normal for me to feel this way, let alone putting a pain scale to it to say, here is the effect it's having on me. This is how I'm experiencing it, the severity, the burden it has for me. I mean, this is a question that, I think we're probably a little unique in this and how we approach this. But so we took our wellness questionnaires, and just for a little backstory, they're linked to our training systems, and we ask our athletes to complete them. I would love them to do them daily, but at least when they train. And there's a series of questions to get into fatigue and sleep and things like that, but we added this pain question really last year, I think, to get more detailed about what are you experiencing pain, where is that pain, and then give me that rating so we have an idea. And so from March until literally today, we had 30% of our pitchers at some point throughout the spring season or this summer season report pain of some kind. And I think it's also important to clarify, we're not just talking about arm pain here, right? I mean, a lot of the things that you brought up were low back issues, hip issues. It's not just about the arm, it's really the total effect that pitching has on the body. And so 30% of our pitchers at some point reported pain.
Yeah, it's overwhelming, and there's no doubt about it. It is like something we have to address. I mean, it's just a couple days ago where Krista shared something in like a group message to us about like the celebration and social media around such and such pitcher through X games in one day and had, X wins and this many strikeouts, and we're all like, that's amazing. And the first thing I always think is like, there's no way, even if that athlete has great movement quality and has great efficiency, there's no way that was what was right for that athlete. There's no way that she's feeling great the next day. Can you imagine if in baseball culture we did that? Roger threw 3 complete games today. What a hero, So I think of like, we've created this culture where we celebrate the more you do and that you can like bear it and keep going, you get the accolades. So that's tough because pitchers don't want to report pain, obviously. We have a way of like, we're not, as we'll go into the next episode, we don't shut pitchers down because of pain. We're not talking about injury. We're talking about where they start feeling this pain. We're going to really clarify that in the next episode. But they don't always say it because they're afraid if I say it, I'm going to come out. And pitchers who just pitch all the time and keep having success, this is who we celebrate in our game. So I think it's important to sort of like pull back, and like really look at what's underneath of this like blanket culture that we've created. I'm like, our athletes are in pain. It's time to wake up.
Yeah, if you're a clinician listening to this, PT, AT, physician maybe out there in the world, I think even just asking this question of, what are you experiencing is half the battle. We have to know the answers to these things. We have to know that our pitchers are in pain, that the pain they're experiencing is frequent and sometimes it's constant. And I have learned a lot with an AT background of, as Ashley said, they don't want to be shut down. And I think the way as we'll talk about approaching, using submaximal throwing and some of these things that we can utilize to navigate this, lets them have confidence that it's okay to talk about that. I hear often of just pitchers saying like, I don't want to tell you I'm in pain because I don't want you to shut me down. Ultimately it's not our decision, right? But we can help her navigate that without saying, no, you have to stop pitching. We shouldn't even advocate for that. So I think, as clinicians, if you are working with these athletes, you've got to create a culture of, I need you to tell me these things so I can be better informed and so I can better help you, and avoiding this, you're going to shut me down conversation, because it instills a lot of fear.
For sure. Yeah. And we're going to go into our like wellness questionnaire and such in the next episode. But I really just wanted to paint this picture of like what we're seeing. Sometimes we have athletes that when they're reporting, hey, I'm in season and I have pain, the first thing that we're going to say is like, let's make sure you have an updated assessment. Let's take a look at what's going on. So switching back to the screen here, let's take a look at an example that's quite common here. Okay, this is an athlete where we took a look at her movement quality, if you will. This is a little bit of a different version of the assessment, but same idea. You can see her mobility was pretty good, a little bit of hamstring tightness, but mobility was pretty good before going into high school season. And now rotation has just essentially blown apart. The reason for that is because stability has regressed so much. Her stability has regressed so much that now being able to rotate just doesn't happen. Essentially, what goes on is that as stability goes down because it's fatigue, now all of a sudden she's launching through not able to put the brakes on, and she's in poor posture, as we saw in some of those examples. And now she's rotating from all the wrong places. So here comes pain. Here comes the back issues. Here comes the forearm issues. And so this is like tales all this time. Now, this particular picture didn't have lat regression. We often see lat regression in addition. But what's going on is like they're unstable. They're tired. So they're becoming more unstable, and so they're not rotating well in the motion, and so it starts to influence their mobility, and now here we go, around and around we go.
Yeah, it's the anterior core. Now, this particular athlete didn't have a severe regression, but sometimes I even see like their ability even to do a posterior tilt without the pitching motion. They don't even have the ability to tap into that with their core. It's really alarming sometimes. They've lost this ability to even be able to bring their posture back to neutral, and they're almost stuck a lot in that. And then you start to see the breaks in rotational capacity. As you said, their posture's breaking constantly in the motion. They've got to buy that rotation from somewhere, and they're going to buy it from somewhere. The body's smart, and we'll figure it out. And it just starts to leak into all these other areas of the body that they're going to buy the motion from somewhere. It's not like the demand for the motion stopped. And sometimes it's increased because of, the time of season that they're in. Another pitcher gets injured. There's all kinds of reasons why that workload becomes unexpected. And so if this just gets compounded, and, when we do mobility checks in the middle of the season, I always have to say, don't panic. There are expected declines in mobility. Mm-hmm. If that athlete's up for a movement reassessment and I show them results like this, I always have to say, don't panic. It's not your fault. And it really isn't her fault.
Right.
She's doing the best she can, even trying to lift in season. There is no, as I said to our athletes, there's no wag of the finger here. You are up against it when it comes to trying to maintain your good movement quality you've brought in with you to the season. And it's a beast.
It's a beast. We're measuring these things all throughout the off season. These athletes are looking solid, and then the workload is so extreme and so excessive that it just tanks. It's really alarming. Yeah. So I think it's all of these layers. It's not a simple conversation. It is all of these layers of having to better understand the motion, understanding the movement quality that's needed to go into it, and making sure that workload isn't so excessive that it just totally undermines all of the work they've done to build movement quality. So these are really the pieces. And so this series is not just a rant. No. Basically what we wanted to set this discussion up for is that
this
is the problem. And we really have worked very hard to create strategies and protocols and systems to not only to really keep athletes when they start experiencing pain. Of course, our initial goal is to not have them experience pain, but these are variables that are just like beyond what anyone can control. So if and when they start having pain, then how do we help them navigate that? How do we get them out of pain and moving forward instead of staying in this like pain dysfunction cycle? Yeah. And then hopefully we keep the pain from crossing over into injury. If it does get into injury, of course, then we have to then go into how do we appropriately ramp them up. And what we have found is that when it goes into the injury world, now they start seeking out professionals in healthcare, as they should, right? They're going to PT, or they're going to, as they should, and we would advise them to. But then there becomes this disconnect, whereas like their doctor or the PT gives them like a Googled ramp up from overhand throwing that was created like 8 years ago. It's pretty alarming.
It's generous. I would say probably 20 years ago.
38 years ago we're sticking with. Okay, so basically, the remainder of this series is about these two categories. How we really, when we kind of like see that an athlete has pain? How do we keep it from going into injury? How do we keep it from having to go into the healthcare system, right? Because it's not in injury. We can get rid of it before it turns into injury. And then if we do all we can and that just doesn't happen, and now they're in the healthcare system, how do we make sure they have the right tools to come back in a way that is appropriate and bridges the gap for not only what's going to be asked of them volume-wise, intensity-wise, but how to actually get to where they want to be performance-wise, right? While staying healthy. So these ramp-up protocols and systems that we've created are really robust at this point. And honestly, we never went into this like, let's navigate the pain space. We have simply had to.
We had to. Necessity.
And now at this point, there's no doubt in my mind that when pitchers have pain, we're the best place in the country to come to be able to navigate this space, because we do it on such a regular basis and we're tracking data and we're seeing what works and what to go to. So that is what the remainder of this series is about. We are really passionate about it because it's not only such an important concept, but these are young women that need advocates. They're thrown into a system that is, I always say, like, this system is abusing their bodies. And so I really feel passionately, I know that you do too, Laura. And so I thought this would be such a great topic for us to really jump into and talk about how do we give our athletes better information about their bodies, better training system, better way to navigate even variables that they don't really have control over, and just really own their careers, again, not just from a performance standpoint, but from a wellness standpoint. So exciting topic ahead, more exciting topics ahead.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today, everyone. Just in the layout of this issue, this culture that we have come to know very well, unfortunately, here at S2 Breakthrough. Be sure to join us next episode as we start talking about how we actually navigate pitching and pitching protocols, pitching training when athletes start reporting pain. Between now and then, remember, keep questing on to redefine the circle. Thanks, everyone.